He shouted, "I'll never marry you!" He shouted, "I will never marry you!" A year later, he saw his twin daughters and broke down in the hospital hallway. Hannah Cole never imagined her life would be transformed by a scene so devastating, so humiliating, that it would leave a mark on her soul forever. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, standing tall, giving the news calmly, prepared for surprise, perhaps even awkwardness, but nothing had prepared her for the reaction she got. She stood in the sleek glass and steel office of Hayes Industries, her fingers nervously clutching the small ultrasound photo in her pocket. The morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows, behind the imposing mahogany desk, where Ethan Hayes, in his signature impeccable navy suit, flipped through financial reports as if nothing in the world could ever disturb him. Her heart hammered as she cleared her throat, barely finding her voice. "Ethan," she began, her voice trembling in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like thunder, sudden and sharp, cutting through the room's quiet stillness. At first, he didn't look up. When he finally did, his piercing blue eyes met hers, but they held no warmth, no surprise, no joy, only calculation. Seconds dragged on in silence until he leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands together, and said, almost lazily, "I will never marry you." No emotion, no questions. Just that. Cold, dismissive, final. Hannah felt the air leave her lungs. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved despite every red flag and every warning from her own instincts, had vanished. Or perhaps he had never existed. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. There was nothing to say. Her mind scrambled, looking for logic, a reason, some vestige of the man who once whispered that she meant more to him than any deal or title. Instead, she was looking at someone else entirely, someone indifferent, impenetrable, and ruthlessly distant. He didn't ask whose it was. He didn't ask how far along she was. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply stood up, adjusted his jacket cuffs, and said, "This conversation is over." She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand recognition, but something inside her, something deeper than pride, kept her motionless. She nodded once, turned, and walked out of the office with her back straight, her hands clenched at her sides. As the elevator doors closed behind her, her vision blurred with tears, but her face remained calm. In that moment, she knew she was completely alone, and yet, she also knew she would survive. Not for him, not for the past, but for the life growing inside her. A new life. The days that followed were a blur of silence, cold rain, and a crushing reality. Hannah packed her belongings and left the city without telling anyone. Her apartment lease was in Ethan's company's name. She couldn't bear the thought of staying there another night, breathing the same air that had once smelled of safety, but now only reeked of betrayal. She moved back to a small town 2 hours away, the same one where she had grown up. It was quiet and removed from the chaos of the corporate world. She hadn't been there in years, but the streets felt familiar enough that she felt she could at least breathe again. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment above an old bookstore and began working remotely, taking on small freelance design projects at night while morning sickness racked her body. Every day was harder than the last. There were no calls from Ethan, no attempts to find her, no messages asking if she was okay. The rejection hurt more than she allowed herself to admit. She cried most nights alone in her narrow bed, holding the ultrasound photo against her chest as her belly slowly began to grow. The loneliness was suffocating, but she pushed through. She went to all her doctor's appointments alone, checked off lists of prenatal vitamins, and tried to eat as best she could. Her heart ached, not just from the absence of love, but from the overwhelming pressure of doing this alone. She had no family to lean on. Her mother had passed away 2 years prior after a long battle with cancer, and her father had been absent since she was a little girl. There was no one but her and the 2 small lives silently forming within her. In her second trimester, the doctor confirmed she was expecting twins. She had smiled when she saw them clearly on the screen. 2 tiny profiles, 2 separate sets of arms moving independently, 2 separate heartbeats, strong and fast. It was a brief moment of hope in an otherwise gray existence. She walked out of that appointment clutching the printed ultrasound photos tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks, this time not from fear, but from something closer to elation. No matter what happened, she had them, and that had to be enough. As the weeks turned into months, her body grew heavier and more tired. She still worked long hours because medical bills were piling up quickly and insurance barely covered the essentials. Some nights she fell asleep with her laptop open beside her, aching all over, but refusing to give in. She kept a notebook on her nightstand where she wrote letters to her daughters. She didn't know their names yet, but she wrote to them as if they were already here, as if they could hear her voice in the silence. She told them how much she loved them, how hard she was trying, and how one day, when they were older, she would tell them everything. Truthfully, but gently. She didn't allow herself to think about Ethan. When his name popped into her head, she pushed it away. The man who had once made her feel seen had vanished like a ghost. There was no point in grieving for someone who had already chosen to disappear. Her focus had to remain on the babies and on surviving each day until they arrived. But even as she tried to let go, something in her chest remained bruised, not broken, but wounded in a way that would take time to understand. And so she kept going, quiet and determined, with no idea that fate was already working to bring their worlds together again, in a way neither of them could have ever imagined. A fateful encounter. By the time Hannah reached her 8th month, exhaustion had become her constant companion. The swelling in her legs made it hard to stand for long periods, and the sharp pangs in her lower back forced her to sleep sitting up most nights. Though she rarely complained out loud, her doctor began to notice signs of concern during her weekly checkups. The babies weren't gaining weight as quickly as expected, and Hannah herself was clearly pushing her limits. After a brief scare involving shortness of breath and contractions that started and stopped suddenly, she was admitted to the local hospital for observation, what was supposed to be a precautionary overnight stay. It quickly turned into something more when one of the twins began to show signs of distress during monitoring. The doctors decided to perform an early C-section. Hannah was too exhausted to protest, barely able to process the words as nurses gently prepped her for surgery. Everything felt surreal. The coldness of the hospital gown, the bright lights of the operating room, the low murmur of voices around her. She squeezed her eyes shut and whispered a silent prayer that her daughters would be born breathing. And then she heard it. The first cry, thin and sharp, followed quickly by a second, slightly louder one. Tears streamed down her face. Both girls were alive, small and fragile. They weighed barely 5 pounds each, but they were breathing. The nurses whisked them away to the NICU while Hannah's incision was closed and she was sent to recovery. The days that followed were a whirlwind of beeping monitors, IV drips, and waiting. Her daughters were named Ava and Chloe, names she had written in her notebook weeks before, but hadn't dared to say out loud until they were safe. At first, she could only visit them for brief periods, sitting by their incubators, talking softly to them through tears. They looked so tiny, their faces almost swallowed by the small hats and blankets meant to keep their body temperatures steady. It pained her to leave them each night and go back to her hospital bed alone, but she knew they were in good hands. Still, the ache of not being able to hold them freely, to take them home, weighed heavily on her spirit. The doctors informed her that due to the baby's prematurity and her own post-op weakness, they would all be remaining at the hospital for at least another month, possibly longer. That time stretched to 2 months, then 3. Hannah's savings dwindled quickly, but she refused to show her panic. She pumped breast milk regularly, sat by their side as much as she was allowed, and used her free hours in her hospital room to work on freelance design projects on her old laptop. It was lonely, painfully lonely, and the mental toll was beginning to crack her resolve. She hadn't had a single visitor in weeks. The nurses were kind, but they were busy. Her body was healing, but her heart felt like it was on pause, caught between survival and the life she wanted to build. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Ethan Hayes came to the hospital, completely unaware of who was there. He wasn't visiting for personal reasons. One of his senior business partners had been in a minor car accident and was admitted for observation. Ethan, ever the loyal figurehead of his empire, thought it would be a good gesture to stop by and see the man in person. But between the illegible signage and a distracted receptionist, he took the wrong elevator and got off on the pediatrics floor instead of general care. As he walked down the bright hallway, confused, he glimpsed someone, that made him stop dead in his tracks. At first, he wasn't sure. A woman in a hospital gown, her hair in a messy bun, was standing near a double stroller, adjusting a bottle with practiced hands. Her back was to him, but something about her posture, the curve of her shoulders, felt familiar. She turned slightly, and the light hit her face. It was Hannah. Ethan stood there, stunned. He felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. She hadn't seen him yet. She was humming softly, rocking the stroller gently. Then she looked up, and their eyes met. The world seemed to stop for both of them. Her face went pale. He took an uncertain step forward. Neither of them said a word, and then, slowly, he looked down at the 2 babies, sleeping side by side in the stroller. They both had delicate dark hair, and as one stirred and opened her eyes, a startling, familiar blue, his stomach lurched. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. These were his daughters, not a rumor, not a suspicion. There they were, the living, breathing proof of the life he had rejected. Hannah didn't say a word. She didn't cry or scream. She picked up the bottle, turned her back, and walked calmly into the hospital room. But Ethan couldn't move. His body was rooted to the spot. His heart hammered in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do next. The beginning of an unlikely truce. Ethan stood outside the hospital room door for several minutes, unable to convince his legs to move or his mouth to form words. His brain was still trying to assimilate what his eyes had seen. 2 tiny girls who looked so much like him. It felt as if he were looking at baby photos of himself. The woman he had once dismissed without a second thought was standing just on the other side of that door, raising his children alone, while he had been carrying on with his life, as if nothing had happened. A nurse walked by and looked at him with mild concern, but he quickly straightened himself and knocked twice, softly but firmly. There was a pause, then the door opened halfway. Hannah was there, calm yet cautious, her eyes unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She raised her eyebrows slightly, waiting, and finally stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. The room was small, dimly lit, with a cot pushed up against the wall and 2 bassinets near the window. One of the girls was asleep. The other was stirring softly, making small cooing noises as she waved her fists in the air. Ethan walked in slowly, as if a sudden move might shatter the fragile moment. He approached the bassinets and looked at the baby. Her eyes were closed, but her face was a mirror of her mother's. There was no denying it. They were his daughters. "Are they?" he began, his voice barely a whisper. Hannah didn't look at him. She sat on the edge of the cot and crossed her arms tightly. "Yes," she said simply. "They're yours." The words hit him like a punch. He reeled slightly, then pulled the plastic chair near her bed and sat down heavily. The room was silent except for the occasional beep of a nearby monitor and the soft sighs of the sleeping babies. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, staring at the floor, then at her. She looked so different from the last time he had seen her. Tired, pale, chastened, but stronger somehow. More centered, as if everything he had overlooked before had finally risen to the surface. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, his tone more confused than accusatory. Hannah let out a dry laugh, not cruel, but bitter. "I did. You just didn't care to listen." He opened his mouth to protest, but stopped, because she was right. He had cut her off, dismissed her, closed the door to any possibility that the pregnancy was real or that it mattered. Now he was sitting in the rubble of that moment, trying to pick up pieces that might be too broken to mend. He looked at her again. He truly looked at her. This time, not as a problem to be solved or a mistake to be erased, but as a person who had endured something he couldn't yet comprehend. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "and I didn't know what kind of man I was until now." Hannah turned to him then, not softening, but facing him directly. "They've been in this hospital for 3 months," she said. "They were born premature. I had surgery. I almost lost one of them. I haven't left this room for more than an hour in weeks. So, forgive me if I'm not exactly thrilled to see you here, like you won a medal for being late." Her voice didn't rise, but the anger beneath it trembled like something held tightly in check. Ethan nodded, not defensively, but with a real weight to it. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He looked at his daughters, then at her. "Can I stay?" he asked, "just for a while." Hannah didn't respond immediately. She looked at her babies, both of them now asleep again, and something shifted on her face, less fury, more fatigue. She nodded once. Then she leaned back on the cot and closed her eyes. Ethan remained where he was, unmoving, just sitting there in stunned silence. He didn't know what this meant yet, didn't know what came next, but he understood one thing with crystal clarity. This was no longer about pride or ego or control. It was about showing up. For once in his life, he was willing to start there. The long road back. Ethan came back the next day, sooner than even he expected. He hadn't slept much the night before. His mind had been a restless stream of images and thoughts that wouldn't let him find peace. The sight of those 2 girls, so small and delicate, yet undeniably his, had embedded itself in him in a way that nothing else ever had. He found himself standing back in front of the same hospital room door at 7 in the morning, carrying a paper bag with coffee and a small container of oatmeal, not knowing if Hannah would accept them, but needing to try. He hesitated before knocking, worried she wouldn't want to see him again after yesterday. But when the door opened, she didn't seem surprised. She simply looked at the bag and said, "You're late." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't a rejection either. He walked in, and she took the coffee without comment. The babies were awake, fussy but quiet, and Ethan instinctively went to their bassinets. He peered down at Chloe, who was chewing on her fist, her tiny eyebrows furrowed as if she were concentrating intensely. Hannah watched him carefully, but didn't interfere. She noticed his hesitation when he reached for the bottle and, without speaking, handed it to him, allowing him to feed Chloe under her silent supervision. His hands were clumsy, but he was careful. Chloe accepted the bottle, and Ethan stared at her in awe as her small lips latched on. Something in the weight of that moment grounded him in a way that no boardroom negotiation ever had. From that day on, Ethan came every morning and stayed until the afternoon. He brought food. He asked questions. He read baby books in the waiting room during the girls' naps, and he slowly learned how to change diapers and swaddle them correctly. Hannah didn't make it easy for him. She didn't pretend that his sudden involvement erased months of absence, but she didn't push him away either. She assigned him tasks, let him take turns holding the girls, and even allowed him to be present during some of the checkups with the pediatrician. She remained cool, practical, and completely focused on the babies, giving no hint as to whether she saw a future for the two of them beyond this temporary hospital rhythm. Still, something began to change. In the quiet hours of the day, when the girls were sleeping and the nurses had made their rounds, Ethan and Hannah would sometimes talk. Not about them, not about the past, but about things that felt neutral and safe. He asked her about the freelance work she had been doing, and she told him about the small projects she had taken on, how she had used her skills to get by. He told her about his company's expansion, but in a softer, more human way, like someone describing a life he was no longer sure mattered. She listened, sometimes nodded, but often remained silent. Yet her silence no longer felt cold. It felt cautious, like someone trying to rebuild a wall that had been blown apart. One afternoon, while he was holding Ava against his chest, the baby fell asleep, and Ethan found himself crying. He didn't cry openly, but his eyes grew glassy, and he blinked several times to keep the tears from falling. Hannah saw it and said nothing. She simply passed him a burp cloth without comment, and he accepted it with a grateful look. That moment, quiet and brief, felt like the first thread of trust tightening between them. Neither of them spoke of it afterward, but something unspoken floated in the air from that day on. Ethan stopped checking his phone during visits. He stopped answering work emails from the hospital room. His assistants were baffled by his absence, but he offered no explanations. For the first time in years, business was not first. The girls were, and though Hannah didn't verbalize it, she noticed. She watched him adapt, learn, and try, and though she didn't say the words out loud, a small part of her was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time he meant it. By the end of the 5th week, the nurses no longer raised their eyebrows when Ethan walked in and took one of the girls with the same natural ease as if he had always been there. And though Hannah still kept her barriers high, her gaze lingered on him longer. Her tone softened just slightly, and when he brought a small stuffed giraffe for Ava and a pacifier with a blue ribbon for Chloe, she didn't scoff. She barely smiled, but it was real. Ethan saw it, kept it silently in his heart, and didn't ask for more. For now, his presence was enough. A family comes home. By the beginning of the 3rd month, Ethan had seamlessly integrated into the daily rhythm of the hospital. He was no longer an awkward visitor, but a constant presence. The nurses spoke to him by name, giving him updates on Ava and Chloe without needing to ask who he was. Hannah noticed the subtle shift, too. How he now moved with a natural ease, how confidently he handled bottles, how he knew the exact lullaby that helped Ava fall asleep when she was fussy. He was no longer just trying. He was here, every day, without fail, without excuse. The girls had been steadily gaining weight and were finally nearing the threshold for being discharged. Hannah, though relieved, was also quietly terrified. For 3 months they had existed in this cocoon, sterile and small, but safe. She had grown accustomed to the monitors, the nurses, the shared responsibility. The hospital had become the strange bubble where her life had stabilized, where her heartbreak had been put on pause by necessity. But soon, she would be leaving. And then what? Back to a tiny apartment with barely enough room for a cot, let alone two? Back to the grind of working all night while raising two babies alone? And now, with Ethan's presence becoming a constant, something his daughters had already come to expect. What if he disappeared again? Ethan seemed to sense her anxiety, though she never said it out loud. One night, as Hannah was silently folding the girls' hospital clothes, he asked her softly, "Where will you go when they're discharged?" She hesitated. Then she answered carefully, "To my apartment. It's small, but I've managed." He looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with something more complex. Admiration, guilt, hesitation. "You shouldn't have had to manage on your own," he said. Hannah didn't reply. The silence between them was thick with everything they hadn't said. The next morning he arrived with more than coffee. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a printed lease agreement for a small house a few blocks from her current apartment, one with 2 bedrooms, a yard, and a nursery already furnished. Hannah looked at it in disbelief. "I don't want you to think it's a grand gesture," he said. "You owe me nothing. It's just a place, a safer, easier place for them." She didn't reply immediately. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect her independence, her pride. But then she looked at Chloe, who had just started trying to roll over, and Ava, who had finally gained enough strength to cry loudly when she wanted to be held. Hannah's pride was not more important than their well-being. Still, her voice remained firm. "You aren't buying us," she said. Ethan nodded. "I know, it's not that." Later that night, with the babies asleep, Hannah stood by the window, her arms crossed, as she watched the street lights flicker below. Ethan sat silently on the sofa, one hand resting near Ava's bassinet. He didn't talk much anymore, unless she initiated the conversation. She appreciated that. It gave her space. Still, tonight felt heavier than usual. "Why did you come back that day?" she asked suddenly. He didn't look up at first. Then he closed the book and said, "Because I got lost on the wrong floor. And then I saw you, and I realized everything I had spent my life chasing meant nothing compared to what I had thrown away." His honesty stunned her, not by what he said, but by how he said it. Quietly, without dramatics, without expectation. It wasn't a performance. It was simply the truth. She didn't reply, but she didn't turn away either. She stood by the window a bit longer, and when she finally sat down, she did so next to him. The gap between them was still wide, but not as wide as it had been. The next week, the doctors finally gave the official news. Ava and Chloe were ready to go home. Ethan was in the room when the announcement was made, and Hannah watched him blink rapidly, as if holding back tears. Discharge papers were signed, car seats were brought in, and tiny matching outfits were chosen. Ethan carried the bags. Hannah carried Chloe. A nurse wheeled Ava out to the waiting hallway. For the first time in months, they stepped out of the hospital into the open air, the late afternoon light casting soft shadows on the pavement. Ethan didn't ask to go with them. He didn't offer. He simply followed in his own car, parked across the street from their new building, and waited until she unlocked the front door. He helped bring in the bags, and then he stood in the doorway, uncertain. Hannah looked at him. Then she stepped aside to let him in. It was small. It was crowded. There was barely room for the bassinets. But it was warm. And it was theirs. And now, for the first time, she felt that maybe it didn't have to be hers alone. A new rhythm. The first few days at home were harder than Hannah had imagined, even after months in the hospital. Despite the joy of finally being out of the sterile walls and artificial light, she now had to face the full weight of life on her own turf. 2 newborns required her attention every hour. Feedings bled into one another. Sleepless nights became the new normal. The apartment felt even smaller now. The bassinets took up the entire bedroom, and the tiny kitchen barely accommodated a bottle sterilizer and pump. Hannah found herself struggling to handle even the simplest things, like taking a shower or making a full meal. The silence of the home, which was once a source of peace, became overwhelming in those long, crying-filled nights. Ethan didn't ask to stay. He never imposed. But the day after they were discharged, he showed up at her door just after dawn with bags of groceries, and she didn't stop him from coming in. He moved quietly through the kitchen, stocking the refrigerator with essentials, setting up a coffee maker, and making oatmeal while the girls slept. When Hannah woke to the smell, for the first time in weeks, her body felt something close to safety. She walked into the kitchen, her eyes bleary and not knowing what to say. But he didn't press her. He simply handed her a cup of coffee and said, "Sit. Eat. I'll change them when they wake up." That became their rhythm. Ethan would arrive every morning and leave late in the afternoon. Sometimes he would cook. Sometimes he would just clean. But he was always present. He held the girls when Hannah needed to nap. He walked them around the apartment when they were fussy and sat with them in the middle of the night when colic stole their sleep. Hannah hesitated at first, always waiting for the moment he would stop showing up. But it never came. He returned again and again, each time more comfortable, more familiar, more quietly rooted in their lives. One night, 2 weeks after they came home, Hannah found him sitting on the living room floor with both girls in his lap. They were dressed in matching onesies, and he was reading them a picture book about animals, mimicking the sounds with a sweetness she never would have expected from the man who once dismissed her with such finality. She stood in the hallway, watching all 3 of them under the soft glow of the lamp. Something in her chest ached in a way she couldn't describe. It wasn't just the sight of her daughters smiling or the warmth in Ethan's voice. It was that, for the first time since she said she was pregnant, she didn't feel alone in surviving. He noticed her watching, but said nothing. He simply continued reading, his voice quiet and steady. Later that night, when the girls were asleep, Hannah offered him a beer from the fridge, an unspoken gesture of something changing between them. They sat on the sofa, their shoulders barely touching, the soft hum of the baby monitor filling the silence. Ethan drank slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I think about that day in the office more than you know," he said finally. "What I said, what I didn't say. I was a coward. I was selfish. I thought walking away would make it disappear." Hannah didn't reply immediately. She stared straight ahead, unsure whether his regrets should comfort her or infuriate her. But she finally said, "I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed you to care." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't care. Not then. But I do now." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked at her then, truly looked at her, like someone seeing the full weight of what he had lost. Hannah's hands tightened around her mug. She wasn't ready to let go of all the pain. Not yet. But she was also tired of carrying it alone. "This isn't about us," she said finally. "It's about them. I can't afford to let them trust someone who won't stay." Ethan nodded again, this time more slowly. Then he said, "I'll keep staying until you believe I will." And he did, day after day. Hannah stopped counting after the 4th week. By then, he had also started helping with the freelance work, setting up her website, handling minor invoices, giving her room to sleep a few hours between client calls and feedings. He never brought up their past unless she did. He never hinted that he wanted more. He simply became a part of her life, a quiet, unwavering support. Even the neighbors started referring to him as the girl's dad. And Hannah didn't correct them, because in every real sense, he was. In the girl's 6th month, Ethan surprised her. He had printed every photo he had taken over the last few months, the first baths, the first smiles, the sleepy cuddles, and had organized them in a handcrafted scrapbook, leaving the last page blank. When she asked why, he said softly, "Because we're still writing the rest." Hannah stared at the blank page for a long moment before she closed the book and whispered, "Let's hope the story is worth finishing." Ethan moved across the sofa and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. In that moment of quiet, there was no expressed forgiveness, no declarations of love, or dramatic promises. Only presence, only choice. And for now, that was more than enough. The final promise, the night before Ava and Chloe's first birthday, Hannah found herself alone in the living room, surrounded by balloons she hadn't yet hung and cupcakes she hadn't frosted. The girls were asleep in their bassinets after a chaotic evening bath, and Ethan had gone to pick up some last-minute decorations at the store. The apartment, though still small, now felt different, filled with warmth and history, marked by the constant hum of the life that had been built carefully and painfully over the last year. The walls showed signs of their story, framed photos, crayon smudges, and even a small dent near the hallway from when Ethan accidentally bumped the stroller into the corner. Hannah stood in the quiet, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to absorb the reality of what they had become. This year had tested her in every imaginable way. There were nights she had cried alone in the bathroom just to release the pressure of being a mother, a provider, and a protector all at once. But Ethan had been there, every single day, quietly reinforcing the foundation beneath her with actions, not promises. He never pressured her. He never rushed her healing. He never demanded what their relationship should be. Instead, he gave himself over to the role of father with a devotion that sometimes awed her. He remembered every doctor's appointment, handled middle-of-the-night fevers with calm and precision, and had memorized their favorite songs, their feeding schedules, even which pacifier each of them preferred. Sometime, without either of them ever announcing it, they had become a family. When he returned that afternoon, his arms full of streamers and paper crowns, he gave her a tired but genuine smile. "I think I bought out the entire party aisle," he joked. But Hannah could hear the underlying nerves in his voice. They both knew what tonight symbolized. It wasn't just a birthday. It was the end of the first chapter, and possibly the beginning of something more. After the girls were tucked in again, after tiny stories, and Chloe's stubborn refusal to go to sleep until Ethan had rocked her for a full 10 minutes, Hannah and Ethan found themselves sitting at the small kitchen table, sharing a slice of the premature birthday cake. The air was different, more fragile. She looked at him and said, "You've done more than I ever expected." He looked back at her, carefully. "I didn't come here to prove something. I came because I couldn't imagine not being here." She hesitated. Then she got up and walked over to the small living room shelf, where the scrapbook still sat. She opened it to the last page, the one that was blank, and placed there a photo she had printed just hours before. It was of all four of them on the sofa, the girls in matching pajamas, Ethan in the middle of a hearty laugh, and Hannah looking at him with an expression she hadn't realized had been captured, hopeful, open, complete. She slid the photo into the sleeve and whispered, "That's our new first page." Ethan walked across to the room slowly, not knowing what to say. But before he could speak, Hannah turned to face him head-on. "You hurt me, more than I thought I could ever recover from," she said, her voice firm. "But you stayed. You stayed through every hard night, every diaper, every fever, every fight. You showed me who you could be, and that version of you. I love him." It wasn't a dramatic kiss or an overwhelming embrace. She simply stepped forward and took his hand. Her fingers trembled. "Then let me be him. Forever. For you. For them." And this time she didn't hesitate. She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to lean into him, not because she needed saving, but because she finally believed she didn't have to carry it all alone. The next morning, their apartment was filled with laughter, with babies squealing and the slightly off-key singing of two tired but joyful parents. Balloons bounced off the ceiling, streamers tangled on chairs, and cupcakes were smeared onto small hands. It wasn't a perfect party, but it was real, and that made it beautiful. Friends dropped by with gifts, neighbors came in to hug the girls, and Hannah stood by the window at one point, holding Chloe while Ava crawled after a balloon, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Ethan came up behind her, his hand resting softly on her back. "I know I can't go back and rewrite everything," he said softly, "but I want to write the rest with you, whatever that is." Hannah turned and kissed his cheek. "Then let's just keep turning the page together." And in that crowded, joyful, chaotic room, they did just that. No grand vows, no perfect ending, just love in its truest, most patient form. This story doesn't end with a dramatic twist, but with something far more powerful, a quiet redemption. What makes the ending so satisfying isn't just that Ethan changes, it's that he earns his way back into the lives he once walked away from, not through apologies, but through presence, effort, and time. Hannah doesn't forgive easily, and she shouldn't. Her strength lies not only in surviving on her own, but in choosing to let someone back in on her own terms. The girls, too young to know their father's mistakes, become the very reason he becomes someone worthy of trust. That's what gives this story its weight. Not just love found, but love rebuilt. And in a world where people so often leave when things get hard, seeing someone stay, truly stay, is the most surprising and beautiful ending of all. What did you think of the new name and the slow burn ending? Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of redemption and love.